Salete omnes, it's Magister Compton again, and today we're going to be talking about one of the three participles that Latin uses, the present active participle. This is the most challenging one because it's the one that requires the most work, as you'll see. We do tend to use these somewhat frequently, so it's important that we know what we're looking at, how to make them, and so on. So, if this one needs a little more time, then that's fine. If you need to come back and look at this a few more times, be my guest. The other two participles, the perfect passive and the future active, are much, much less intensive in terms of what to do with them. So this will be the longest of the videos. Let's get right into it. So a present active participle. It's important to understand that a present active participle, like anything labeled present tense with verbs, is going to use the present stem. Because remember, as we talked about with the what are participles video, a participle is coming from a verb, even though it's acting as an adjective. So we're going to have to use some part of the verb to make it. In this case, we're going to use what we would normally use for the present stem. So let's review that. If we've got a first conjugation verb, like one that has long ARE in it, or a second conjugation verb, one that has long ERE in it, then we will take the second principal part and remove the RE. So for example, amare, our favorite first conjugation verb, we take the RE off of amare and we get ama. That's our present stem. If it's third with a short ERE or fourth conjugation with a long IRE, we're instead going to take the first principal part, remove the O, and add an E. So here's an example, genuflecto, which would be the word for kneel. We take off the O, and we have genuflect. Then we're going to add an E to that, and we're going to get genuflecta. So that's our stem. That's the base we're going to use to create the present active participle. All right? So how do we actually turn it into a present active participle? So the first step is you take the present stem and you add the ending ns. This makes the participle a nominative singular form. And this nominative singular form covers all three genders, male, female, and neuter. So here's an example. Genuflecta plus ns equals genuflectanes. That would be a nominative singular, male, female, or neuter present active participle. I go back and take that same present stem, so not the one with ns on it, just the present stem from earlier, and I'm going to add ntis to it. Now I've made it genitive singular, and this is going to once again be all three genders. So I take my stem of genuflecta, and I add entis to it, and now I get genuflectentis. So genuflectens, genuflectentis. That's the participle. And then when I go to decline it, so I got to make it other things besides nominative or genitive singular, I'm going to take the is off of genuflectentis, and I'm going to replace it with my third declension endings, just like any other third declension adjective like focalus or ingains or fortis or whatever it might be. So this is going to use all those third declension endings you're familiar with, long I and EM and ES and so on and so forth. There's a few exceptions in there. We'll talk about exactly which endings you're going to be working with later on, but this is the basic form. Something with NS and then something with NTIS, and then that NTIS form is the basis for doing all the other forms of the participle. Okay, so we have an example here, genuflectent. We took the is off of genuflectentis, and in this case, we're going to add an em to get genuflectentem, and this would be the accusative singular for masculine and feminine. And again, any ending that you know from third declension could go in place of em. It would be the same result. Long I, es, ibus, you name it, it goes on the same way. Now, the present active participle, unlike the other two, can be used three ways. The first is just as a regular adjective. So this would just be an adjective modifying a noun. There's nothing else extra to it. So an example of that using our verb genuflecto would be the kneeling girl. Kneeling just describes the girl. It doesn't say where she's kneeling or in what way she's kneeling or anything else like that. It's just a kneeling girl. The next possibility is we use it as a verbal adjective. And so we're kind of leaning more into the verb side of it in this case. And we know it's a verbal adjective because there's some kind of direct object or other predicate that comes off of that noun, or off of that participle, my bad. So using our example from before, Atalanta kneeling on the ground. So in this case, we know where she's kneeling. That's the quote-unquote predicate for the participle. And then the third use is the substantive use. And we've talked about substantives before. All that means is we're using the adjective as a noun. So in this case, we could say the green men underestimated the kneeler. There's not going to be any other noun in the sentence that is used the same way as kneeler. So it is, in this case, the direct object. It's going to be an accusative when we put it into Latin. But there won't be any other accusatives that go with it. There won't be a noun that goes with it. Kneeler is the noun. So think of it as like the one kneeling or the girl kneeling or something like that. But since it's easier just to say, kneeler, that's how we do it. The most common example, and you'll see this when you get into Latin poetry, the verb amo, its participle amans, amantis, is often used to mean lover. You might see some other examples, but that's going to be the most common. Amans, amantis as lover. That's a substantive use. Not that it happens a lot, but we could also turn one of these participles into an adverb. So just like we would take off the is and add whatever third declension ending we want, we could instead add an er. And so amantis, loving, could be turned into amanter, lovingly. Again, doesn't happen very often, but we could do it because since it is an adjective, we are able to turn those into adverbs. All right, so next up, we want to look at see how is the participle being used in each of these sentences. What's it modifying? And how is it being used? Is it being used as a verbal adjective, a regular adjective, a substantive? You name it. So the green men ran past the soldiers defending the king. Okay, so we look at the sentence, the green men, subject, ran, that's the main action, past the soldiers defending the king. Okay, so defending, that's another action thrown into the sentence. And in this case, defending is modifying the soldiers. But who are the soldiers defending? Well, the king. So this would be an example of using a sentence, using a participle as a verbal adjective. Because we have, first of all, the participle modifying a noun, soldiers, but they're defending someone, the king. So king would be a direct object to defending, and king would go into the accusative. Here's another example. The Bengals beat the defending champions, the Chiefs. Take a look at that one for just a second. Think about what's going on. All right, so we've got the Bengals. That's our subject. The main action is beat. And then defending is once again the participle. But in this case, no one is defending anything. The word defending is just modifying that word champions. And then Chiefs is a positive telling us who those champions were. So defending does not have its own direct object. It's just modifying the noun champions. So in this case, the participle is being used as a regular adjective. All right. Another example here. Hercules gave excellent training to the defenders. Take a look at that one. So, Hercules is our subject. Gave is the main action. Gave what? Gave training. You could argue that that's a participle, but we have a noun for that in Latin, exercitus, exercitus. So we're not going to treat that as a participle. But we do have another word here, defenders, and that is coming from a verb too. And they're the ones doing it. So in this instance, this would be an example of the substantive use. And defenders in this sentence, because we're giving something to them, that would be a dative noun. So defendentibus would be the correct answer there. All right? When we have to decline present active participles, they decline like their normal third declension nouns, not as I stems. That's what most third declension adjectives usually do, but not present active participles. So no having to worry about adding extra I's to UM or to A or anything like that. The one exception, because there's got to be exceptions, especially when we're dealing with anything labeled third, is the ablative singular. If the ablative singular is used on a participle that's just being a regular adjective, then we would end it with a long I, like we would if this was a plain old third declension adjective. But if we're using it as a verbal adjective, so if it's taking a predicate, or if we're using it as a substantive, so we're using it more as a noun, then we would treat it like it's just a third declension noun, and we would stick an E on it. It's not a rule that you really need to be super familiar with and memorize and have stored up, but I just want you to understand that there are two possible ways you'll see the ablative. And this is why you'll have those two different ways. It is a nice clue, too. If you have a participle with a long I on it and it's ablative, then you know it's being used as a regular adjective. It shouldn't have any kind of predicate. There shouldn't be any direct object for it or anything else. If it has an E on it, then you know it's being used either as a verbal adjective with some kind of predicate, some kind of direct object or whatever, or as a substantive. But you probably could figure that out from context. So again, don't be super worried about memorizing this. Just be aware this is why you might see two different ways of making an ablative. And when you translate it, typically it's going to just take the meaning of the verb and then adding ing to it. There are more complicated ways to do it. As we get more familiar with participles, we can talk about translating the participle and its noun and its quote-unquote predicate more like a clause. But for right now, if you see one, just stick an ing on it in English. That's the most useful thing you can do. If it's a substantive, then we're typically going to add er, like defender, lover, kneeler. The one who does it, the one who does that action. That's what that er suffix typically implies for a noun. Okay? Last thing we're going to look at is some example sentences. So some of the ones that we've had from earlier in our PowerPoint. So this was our very first example from the last video. Atalanta soli genuflectens, subito sorrexit, et hostes opugnavit. So our participle genuflectens is going back to Atalanta because she's the one doing the kneeling. So genuflectens is got the ns on it, so that means it's nominative, it's singular, and in this case it would be feminine, though obviously since it's the same for all three genders, not really the most important part. Be aware, ns could also be accusative, neuter, and singular, because nominative and accusative have to match in the neuter. But otherwise, if you see ns on a participle, pretty safe bet it's modifying the subject. Okay? And notice how this is written. Atalanta soli genuflectens. So where is she kneeling? solely on the ground. That comes between Atalanta and the participle modifying it. So it's kind of like the way a normal sentence is written. Atalanta is the subject, quote unquote, of the participle. The participle is the action, and then everything that goes with the participle is in between the noun and the participle. Just like having, as you can see here, Atalanta subito surrexit et hostes oppugnavit. The predicate of the verb goes in between the verb and the subject. So participles that take a direct object or some other predicate, they're often going to be written the same way. So something to keep an eye out for. If there's space between the noun and the participle, the space usually means that there's something in the middle that's following from the participle, like in this case, solely. Another example, Bengali victores defendentes principes vicerunt. So the Bengals, Bengali, that's our subject, and then victores defendentes. So victores is modifying defendentes. All right. Now, you could say, well, wait a minute. Victores is in between defendentes and Bengali. Well, Bengali and defendentes can go together because defendentes could be noun to plural. And you're right, it could. But that would mean the sentence says the Bengals Bengals, comma, defending the victors conquered someone. Well, I hope you realize that doesn't make much sense. So in this instance, Bengali is the subject, vicerunt is the verb, so those go together. And then victores defendentes would be whom they defeated, whom they vicerunt. So they defeated the defending champions, the principes, the chiefs. So again, this is using it as a regular adjective. And as an adjective, it usually will come after its noun that it's modifying, just like a normal adjective would. Hercules defendentibus disciplinam egregiam dedit. So we see that defendentibus, you see the NT in the word, so that's a good sign that we're dealing with a participle. We know defendo comes from a verb, so again, another reason to think this is a participle. But notice the ibus ending. Nothing else has an ending like that. There's nothing with an is or another ibus or an abus. So this is the only word of its case in the sentence. That's how you would know this is being used as a substantive, because there's nothing else that looks like it in the sentence. So this is our example from one of the earlier slides. Hercules dedit, Hercules gave. Disciplinam egregiam, so I said exercitus before, disciplina also works. Disciplinam egregiam, excellent discipline, excellent training, and he gave it to somebody. Hence why defendentibus is written with ibus, a dative ending, because we're giving to them. Defendentibus would be the indirect object. And then one last example, because we hadn't really seen an example of this, but I wanted to show you what it might look like. Mater sorori amanter dixit. So our participle amant, you see the NT in there, but amanter has that ER ending on it. So this time is not being used as an adjective, it's being used as a adverb. So mater, mom, dixit, spoke to whom? Sorori, to her sister. How did she do it? Well, amanter being an adverb would tell us how she did it. And amanter in this case would mean lovingly. As an adverb, don't forget, you got to put the ly on it. So lovingly. Still has the ing because it is a participle, but the ly now tells us that it's an adverb usage, not a adjective usage. All right, so that wraps up the present active participle. As I said, go back and watch this video as many times as you need to make sure you get it. This is the more complicated of the three, so it might take you a few run-throughs just to make sure you feel comfortable with it. The next two will go by compared to this, blazingly fast. So until then, vale te omnes.